Good morning and welcome to 10 Years Hence. Leo Burke directs the Global Commons Initiative at the Mendoza College of Business at Notre Dame. The Global Commons Initiative offers courses on the commons both within Mendoza and in conjunction with partners such as the United Nations. From December 2000 through June 2008, he served as Associate Dean and Director of Executive Education here. During his tenure as Associate Dean, Notre Dame Executive Education successfully launched several new programs, including an Executive MBA program in Chicago and the highly acclaimed Executive Integral Leadership Program. His current teaching interests center on the global commons, emerging trends in business and society, and radically new models of leadership development. Prior to joining Notre Dame, Leo Burke served in a variety of roles at Motorola Incorporated, including Director and Dean of the College of Leadership and Transcultural Studies within Motorola University. He was a key architect of premier leadership development programs in both China and India. Leo Burke is the recipient of honors and awards from both Motorola and Notre Dame. He holds a BA in sociology from the University of Notre Dame and an MA in political science from Indiana University, as well as an MS in organizational development from Aurora University. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome Leo Burke.
Thank you, Jim. Good morning. It's a delight to be with you, and I'd like to just start with a story. I teach executive MBAs, and we talk about the commons, and a couple of years ago, there was a guy who was a hedge fund manager in Chicago, and as we talked about the commons, a light bulb went off for him about something that was near and dear to his heart. When he was a young boy, his family had a cottage on the Illinois River, the southern part of Indiana, and he loved that river. He loved that river as a kid. And as an adult, as he became an adult and had kids of his own, he bought a cottage on the Illinois River so he could take his kids there. And then he found out that the Illinois River was getting pretty sick, that there were chemical companies upstream that were polluting that river, and the Indiana Department of Natural Resources wasn't doing anything to clean it up. And so this river that he loved was becoming sicker and sicker and sicker. And in the course that we had talking about the commons, he realized that this river was a commons. The Illinois River belonged to everybody, not just the chemical companies and not just the department responsible for cleaning it up, but to all the citizens. And to the extent that they could be involved, maybe there's a chance to make this resource once again more vibrant. So the light bulb that went off for him was that these commons are all around us. And so today, it might be a concept you knew very little about walking into this auditorium, and maybe by the end of this morning, you'll know a little bit more and appreciate things a little bit more. So the first thing we're going to do is actually get a baseline. What do we mean by the commons? What's this all about? So what we're going to do is I'm going to say everything you wanted to know about the commons in 5 words, okay? 5 words. So the first word is ancient. Ancient. The commons are ancient, an ancient idea. Aboriginal people in prehistory, 50,000 years ago, understood what it meant to have shared resources that would benefit the entire community and develop structures and rules that enable them to do that very effectively, very effectively. The first time in history that the commons were actually codified into law was in 535. The Emperor Justinian wrote something called the Justinian Code, where he gathered together all the laws in the Roman Empire. And they had categories. There were categories for res privatae and res publicae and res communes. So things that were private and could be owned privately, things that were public and owned and managed by the state, and then things that were held in common by everybody. The air, the water, the seashore, things like that. a landmark in history relative to the commons occurred 2 years after the Magna Carta. The Magna Carta was in 1215, and it was really an armistice of sorts between King John and the barons, who had been at a sort of really a civil war in England. And they came together, and King John ceded some of the rights that he had as an absolute monarch. And then 2 years later, there was something called the Charter of the Forest in 1217. And the Charter of the Forest, for the first time in history, accorded rights to people to use the commons, to use the royal forest for collecting firewood, for timber to fix their homes, for pastures to graze their sheep or their pigs all together. And that law, the Charter of the Forest, remained in effect for 750 years until it was replaced by an updated law in 1971. So the commons are ancient and go back a long, long way and really reflect a dimension of what it means altogether to be human. So our second word is that the commons are diverse. The commons are diverse. There are many things that we could consider commons altogether. So we'll go over a few of these. So the first, when we think of natural resources, are often considered to be commons. So whether they are forests or mountains or bodies of water, these can be considered commons. Lakes, rivers, oceans, and very important for our lives altogether and for the ecosystem of the earth. But there are other kinds of commons. Digital commons, for example. What's an example of the digital commons? Of course, yeah, the internet. What would our lives be without the internet today? And features that rest on top of the internet are also commons, like Wikipedia, that many of you use yet today altogether. And so this has spawned in the digital commons all kinds of new ways of thinking about how we manage intellectual property, for example. So the general software license, which enables open and shared software, is something new that we didn't even see before the internet. And now we have the Creative Commons license that enables us to freely share works and sample music and do a range of interesting and creative things. So we have natural resource commons, we have all kinds of digital commons, and these are multiplying so fast today. And then we also have what you might call social commons and cultural and knowledge commons. So you can think of just a couple of examples. You can think of a library as a commons, depending on how it's managed, but a library could be a commons. Public plazas are definitely part of our common space for interacting together as citizens and as social creatures. But it's even more than that. You can think of things like language. Language is, in fact, a commons. Who owns English? Who owns German? Who owns Spanish? Well, those are silly questions, right? Even though some companies today are trying to copyright letters of the alphabet and certain words in common use. And then things that are in our common experience, such as recipes, as an example, that get passed on from one generation to another such that we don't even know where they came from. They're part of our collective cultural commons. So the commons are, first word is the commons are ancient. And the second word, diverse. Right. Ancient and diverse. The third word is commoning. Commoning means that we're operating together as commoners. How many of you have heard of a phrase called the tragedy of the commons? Anyone hear of the tragedy of the commons? Yeah. So in 1968, there was a biologist by the name of Garrett Hardin who wrote a very famous article published in Science magazine called The Tragedy of the Commons. And his example that he gave was you have a common meadow where people are grazing their cows. And each farmer will tend to optimize his return on investment. And so he'll bring as many cows to the meadow as possible. And what will happen is the meadow will be overgrazed. Eventually, the soil will erode, and the commons will be destroyed. And the phrase he used in the article was, the inherent logic of the commons inherently, remorselessly generates tragedy. And so this article and this phrase really fixed in the public mind for a long time. And in fact was, for policymakers and political leaders, it became sort of a goad to saying, well, we need to manage commons, and the way to do that is to manage it, to privatize them and manage it through the private sector. Now, there are other views on this, and one other view came through a woman named Elinor Ostrom, who, she just passed away last year. In 2009, she was awarded the Nobel Prize in Economics. First woman to be awarded the Nobel Prize in Economics. And she and her colleagues, for decades, studied hundreds of commons around the world. And Ostrom said, hold on. We don't necessarily need to have situations where commons end in tragedy. And in fact, history shows that through centuries sometimes there have been successfully managed commons. And she studied a variety of commons, including fisheries and forests and agricultural setups. I'll give you an example of a couple of these. One is, there's a town called Alanya in Turkey, where fishing is a major industry. One of the big challenges with fishing is, how do you not overfish? So, for a long time, the fishermen get together every year, and they have a lottery. And the lottery determines where their spots will be out in the harbor and beyond the harbor, where they can fish, where the good fishing areas are. And so they'll be assigned a spot based on lottery. And then every month during the fishing season, they'll rotate. For half the year, they rotate clockwise, and the other half of the year counterclockwise. And this has proven to be very effective. They can monitor each other's behavior. They can talk to each other when they have disputes. And the fishery in Alanya is managed in a sustainable way. In Spain, in Valencia, Spain, it's very hot, dry climate. Their water is obviously a scarce resource. There's a river called the Turia River, and off of this river run 7 canals. And these 7 canals are managed by collectives of farmers and have been managed for centuries. The records go back into the 1400s. And every week, the representatives of these canals will meet and determine which farmers get how much water, and depends on whether we have a severe drought this year or there's enough rainfall. And they also do this reciprocal monitoring to make sure nobody's cheating. And if they catch somebody cheating, this person comes to a water court. There's no judge or lawyers. It's just the farmers involved. And they're able to work through these disputes. And so the commons of this water that goes through these canals is managed in a way, and has been over centuries, that works sustainably. There is Yamanoka is a village in an alpine area in Japan. That's Mount Fuji in the background. And like several other alpine villages, there are millions and millions of acres held in common land, common trust. And the way this works is there's private land in which people grow agricultural products. And then there's the common land that is assigned to collectives of households to manage every year. And they can use that for forestry products, for looking at fuel, for mats and straw and so forth. And that the processes that they have actually also date back centuries. So what Ostrom found, she said that Garrett Hardin, with this notion of the tragedy of the commons, what he was really describing was something called an open access regime, which means here's something and it's up for grabs for anybody. But there can be common pool resources that can have a set of rules attached to them. And if they are those rules, then the commons can be managed. And so part of those rules, Ostrom was able to codify in a series of 8 principles and said, I'm not making this stuff up. We've just studied hundreds of commons around the world, and the ones that are working do these things. And the ones that are not working didn't do some of these things. So we have a picture. We have a picture of what it takes to have successful commons. And particularly, Ostrom and her colleagues were working in the area of natural resources. So this notion of commoning, when we work together as commoners, we can figure things out. And if there are ways for looking at who has access to resources, who can use those resources, and how do we manage when we don't agree? How do we manage disputes? When those kinds of things are in place, a commons can work. So the first word we said was ancient. The second word was diverse, right. Third word was yeah. So our fourth word is stewardship. So here's something important that you ought to know about. Maybe you do already. Currently, when you add it all up, today, we use 1.5 worlds of resources every year. That means that we use 50% more resources than the Earth can generate in any given year, and generate 50% more waste than the Earth can remediate or purify in a given year. And if we sort of stay on this track, by mid-century, we're going to need almost 3 worlds. You're going to be alive by mid-century, most of you. Some of us, sorry, Jim.
Speak for yourself.
And so, what's that going to be like? So here's a really important question for you. And if you don't remember anything else, just remember this one question. Do you want a world that works for everyone? And don't be too quick to answer that. Do you want a world that works for everyone? And if you decide that the answer to that is yes, then that raises some really important questions. One of the questions that raises is, how do we structure things? So right now, we know about the private sector, and you're being in Mendoza, you learn a lot about business and how it operates. We know about the public sector. And the private sector looms large in society today, particularly over the last 30 years. This wasn't always the case, but particularly over the last 30 years, market logic is seen as the dominant arbitrator of societal well-being, for societal well-being. Now, we do know that sometimes the public sector kind of steps up to the plate when things get tough. So 2008, we needed some bailouts around the world. Public sector stepped forward in order to make sure our economies got stabilized. What I'm saying to you to consider is, If you want a world that works for everybody, that in addition to the private sector, in addition to the public sector, we need to consider the role of the commons. So this is not just something kind of off to the side that's interesting to kind of know about, but it's something that is actually, it might be central to the formula for sustainability that we need to have in the world going forward. If we're going to somehow reach equilibrium and not demand having 3 worlds that we need every year, but get back to 1. So really important, this matter of stewardship. And you see, we definitely need markets, of course. And markets provide a whole range of things for us in terms of goods and services. And markets also have a set of characteristics. But the commons also has a set of characteristics that you might say complement the market, with a notion of a longer-term perspective, a notion of intergenerational equity, sustainability, looking at the collective good, those kinds of things, how we collaborate together as commoners. So that'll be really important going forward. I would say I teach a course to executive MBAs called Emerging Trends in Business and Society. And if we meet again 10 years from now, I'll buy you a beer if this isn't true. The world 10 years from now is going to be so dramatically different. 2023, and you still have a lot of your life ahead of you, be so dramatically different than it is today, you will hardly recognize it. Hardly recognize it. Not only in terms of opportunities in business, but how we organize ourselves in terms of nation states and a whole range of things. And so one of the questions will be, what will you do as responsible citizens with regard to a dialogue about the importance of the commons? So, ancient, diverse, commoning, stewardship. So our 5th word is something called enclosure. And I'll just mention it now, and we'll come back to it in a little bit. So the idea with enclosure is a technical term in the commons that happens when we expropriate or take a shared resource, usually for private gain. And here's a video clip that talks about the historical dynamic of enclosure.
We can really begin to take a look at the emergence of the modern age with the enclosure movements of the great European commons in the 14th, 15th, and 16th century. Medieval life was a collectively lived life. It was a brutish, nasty affair, but there was a collective responsibility. People belonged to the land did not belong to people. And in this European world, people farmed the land in a collective way because they saw it as a commons. It belonged to God. And then it was administered by the church, the aristocracy, and then the local manors as stewards of God's creation. Beginning with Tudor England, we began to see a phenomenon emerge, and that is the enclosure of the great commons by parliamentary acts in England and then in Europe. And so first we began to take the great land masses of the world, which were commons and shared, and we reduced those to private property. Then we went after the oceans, the great oceanic commons, and we created laws and regulations that would allow countries to claim a certain amount of water outside their coastal limits for exploitation. In this century, we went after the air, and we divided it into air corridors that could be bought and sold for commercial traffic for airplanes. And then, of course, the rest is history.
So the rest is history started, as Jeremy Rifkin is telling us, in Tudor England. And there was a period between the 1700s and early 1800s where Parliament passed over 4,000 acts that actually privatized common land. And so by about 1875, 1873, 0.06% of the English population owned 98.5% of the land. There was the Industrial Revolution was going on at the time, or just beginning. And so we have steam power. Steam power can drive mills. Mills can weave fabric. For fabric, we need wool. For wool, we need sheep. For sheep, we need grazing land that needs to be enclosed. And so this was a whole process that happened that displaced all of the commoners who were relying on these resources. And so this began a process that actually continues to this day. And we want to explore this in a little further detail later on, because it's something that we unconsciously participate in. But before we do that, I just want to give a few more examples of the commons. So you have a sense of, well, what is this commons thing altogether? So a commons can be as simple as a community garden. There was a Notre Dame MBA student who took a course on the commons and decided to start a community garden in Chicago. If you know Chicago, it's in the Ukrainian Village area on West Ohio. Gathered some neighbors together, found an empty, vacant lot, contacted the city for the use of the lot. A few people got together and said, this is a good idea. We can get to know each other a little better. Today there's a waiting list. It's created vibrancy in the neighborhood in terms of people getting to know each other and have fun together and raise rutabagas together. So something as simple as this can be a demonstration of the commons. An interesting example of the commons is also called Mundraub. Started in Germany, actually started with the reunification of Germany. In East Germany, there were a lot of orchards, but after the reunification, some of these orchards weren't tended at all. They were abandoned as property rights were reassigned. And so people started to notice that there's lots of loss of fruit, apples and pears just falling on the ground and rotting. So there's a group that started a knowledge commons, where you put on a map where there is available fruit and times of the year that it's available. So you can go and look up in your neighborhood that there's some abandoned orchards, 5 miles from where you live, and now's the time the apples are ripe, and you can go and pick those apples. So, and this is now spreading all throughout Europe and coming to the US as well. The notion of, here's a resource, it's not being used, can we share information in a way that we could gain a benefit? And now people are trading information about some of the fruit trees are diseased, how might they be salvaged, what needs to be done for the health of these resources altogether. So people coming together using the internet, which is important. There is, of course, in the open software world, Linux is sort of a poster child of sorts, right? And most of the world's supercomputers now use Linux as an operating system. And actually, the majority of web servers are Linux-based. So here, the Linux kernel is a part of an open source process that developers all around the world participate in enhancing at freely giving of their labor, so that everybody in the Linux community can use this without any expense. And there's a business model that's built all kinds of consultancy services and add-ons around this. But Linux was one of the early pioneers in something called commons-based peer production, creating tremendous value altogether from a sense of the commons at its core. Very interesting, very interesting. There's something called Arduino. Perhaps you've heard of it, based in Italy, started in Italy. Open source hardware, all kinds of microcontrollers and printed circuit boards that are available. Designs are freely available, so you can either build them yourselves or you can buy kits and assemble them. So for, I don't know, $50, you can put together a computer with Arduino hardware and then use Linux as your operating system. Amazing what we're seeing in the open space today. And more entries into this, and people being willing to collaborate around the world. There is, you might know, MIT has the Open Courseware project. It's now been going for a decade, where their courses are available online for free. You can't get a degree from taking them online for free, but what you can get is access to all that information. So if you're a professor in Vietnam and you want to incorporate some very important physics information from an MIT physics class, you can do that. It costs you nothing. And so the Knowledge Commons is able to continue to expand and grow. Amazing, isn't it? The Cornell University helped start something called the system of rice intensification. A lot of folks around the world eat rice on a daily basis to stay alive. And you know, as we have more and more weather-related problems subject to climate as a result of climate change, that's putting some of our rice crops in peril. Australia just went through this and lost most of its rice crop. System of rice intensification was developed that uses, get this, uses 50% less water and generates 100% more yield. So that's a really good deal. But it's a different way of planting and nurturing the rice. And so the system of rice intensification links together via the internet farmers, rice farmers all around the world who can share their experience about, well, in sandy soil, this is what I needed to do. In clay soil here, this is what I needed to do. And so from Africa throughout Asia to Australia, the system of rice intensification enables cycles of learning to accelerate for the benefit of all. So a knowledge commons that helps ensure that there's more rice available. There are other kinds of cooperative commons as well. One is the architecture for humanity, where designers, builders, architects come together to look at systems where humanity is challenged and put together all kinds of building designs and actually be able to deploy, develop blueprints, source materials, and be able to deploy building, whether it's small hospitals and clinics or housing or whatever. People from around the world can contribute. So there might be an architect in Canada who can contribute to designs that could happen in Haiti or in Indonesia and be a part of this process of serving housing, remediating a housing shortage. There is, one of my favorites is something called the Open Prosthetics Project, and the motto is, prosthetics shouldn't cost an arm and a leg. There are millions of victims of landmines around the world who can never afford prosthetics. But the Open Prosthetics Project designs and builds and then enables in developing nations these designs to be manufactured at a fraction of the cost. And the expertise that goes into these designs is every bit as good as you might get here in the first world altogether. So people contributing, finding a common ground to contribute to the common good. These are all part of the commons. Just a couple more examples. One is something called a Propedia, which is a wiki that looks at, as you see here, all of these categories, from food and architecture, construction, energy, transport, water, all of that, and all kinds of commons-based open source solutions. So if you're working in an NGO in India and have an issue with water, really ought to check out a Propedia to see what kind of water purification systems are available at low cost or hardly any cost. And then another aspect of the Knowledge Commons is something called the Global Innovation Commons, actually started by a speaker who spoke here at 10 Years Hence several years ago. So this one's really interesting. The Knowledge Innovation Commons looks at patents that are held on a whole range of things around the world, again, from water purification to electrical generation, sees in what countries those patents apply, and then for the countries where those patents don't apply, makes that public art available. And so if you're in Botswana, you could go on the Global Innovation Commons and find all kinds of solutions to issues that plague your society. So the commons we can think of as very diverse and very broad, and enables us to be able to come together and do things together to help each other and create a vibrant life together. And so this notion of this question of, do you want a world that works for everyone? You can see how a viable commons is an important part of that. Now, we mentioned enclosure was our fifth word, right? I want to talk about this whole matter of enclosures a little bit because it's really quite important. So a lot of property is sort of fenced off altogether. And you got to wonder, what's going on? What's the impetus around that? So one way I'd like to illustrate this is with a couple of movie clips that look at the logic of enclosure.
Even in the case of air, there's been some progress. And here the idea is to say, look, we can't avoid the dumping of carbon dioxide. We can't avoid the dumping of sulfur oxides. At least we can't at the moment afford to stop doing that. So we're dumping a certain amount of stuff into the environment. So we're going to say, with the current tonnage of sulfur oxides, for example, we will say that is the limit, and we'll create permits for that amount, we'll give them to the people who've been doing the polluting, and now we will permit them to be traded. And so now, there's a price attached to polluting the environment. Now, wouldn't it be marvelous if we had one of those prices for everything?
It sounds like you're advocating private ownership of every square inch of the planet.
Absolutely.
Every cubic foot of air, water.
It sounds outlandish to say we want to have the whole universe, the whole of the earth owned. That doesn't mean I want to have Joe Bloggs owning this square foot, but it means that the interests that are involved in that stream are owned by some group or by some people who have an interest in maintaining it. And that, that is not such a loony idea. It's in fact the solution to a lot of these problems.
So what Michael Walker is epitomizing in his comments here is a perspective that if all the resources on Earth are owned, which is to say they're part of a private sector orientation, that we'll be better off. So that's the dominant logic in the midst of this. And so this notion of ownership equates to private ownership is one that particularly arose in the West, but has not accorded with all kinds of other folks around the world, indigenous people, people in developing nations, tribal people, for instance. This next clip looks at this issue of property and private property, and it's about 3 minutes by a very distinguished Kenyan lawyer who talks about the colonial process and how that shifted things in his country.
What the British did here, they did in Australia, they did it in North America, they did it in South Africa. The notion that communities do not own land, because the concept of ownership under British law is private ownership. And therefore they don't understand how a whole community can own. And that if a community owns, they think that individuals have no rights against the community. What we had here was a situation where communities were themselves juridical persons and therefore controlled definite territories, determined access to land in those territories, the functions for which that access could be given, and the manner in which property rights were allocated, transferred, redistributed, or otherwise transmitted to future generations. And one of the most important aspects of community land law or indigenous land law is that it protected the rights of the unborn as well as the rights of those who are living. And this is why property could not be sold or transferred outside the group. It could be sold or transferred within the group, but not outside the group, because if you transferred it outside the group, you would be expropriating the rights of future generations, and therefore they would not have no sustainable basis for livelihood for that reason. And therefore it was a very developed system of land law. The British, of course, could not accept that. If they accepted that, they would not have had the power to allocate land, quote, legally. And therefore the first thing they did was to say, these people don't understand what ownership is. Secondly, they are not capable of controlling land directly. And thirdly, they don't have the technology to develop it. And therefore, we are going to expropriate title, give it to settlers, pass laws that would enable the settlers to develop it whichever way they wanted it. And the way they dealt with occupation of communities or indigenous communities in areas that they did not need for purposes of settlement, they put them under trust because they argued that the natives could not hold land as juridical persons, so they put them under trust. And the trust concept continued up to independence. And in this country now, land which is not registered in individual names is held by county councils as trustees, and that comes from the colonial concept that communities cannot hold land directly. So the notion...
So the idea here is that ownership equates to private ownership, and when that happens, all kinds of social relationships are disrupted in societies. And that continues even to this day, not just in Africa. There was an example, it was 2 years ago, Camberwell, Australia, had a commons that was a town commons, actually outside of town, meadows, and people would ride their horses and use for recreation. And the state decided to expropriate the land and assign it to a mining company, and for the royalties that the mining company would then give. The citizens had no say whatsoever. So the same thing that was going on in Great Britain in the 1700s was still occurring in Australia in 2010. And this happens not only in terms of, you might say, this notion of enclosure in terms of tangible natural resources, but also intellectual property resources. So for instance, if you look at the way the copyright law has continued to be extended, you have to wonder, is this some kind of enclosure of resources that would otherwise go into the public domain? So a famous example is Mickey Mouse is getting ready to go into the public domain. And was going to go into public domain in 2004. Disney spends a fortune lobbying furiously and in the decade before to say, this cannot happen. We cannot let this become part of the public domain. 1998, the Sonny Bono Copyright Extension Act is passed, and it's part of a whole process of extending copyright and extending copyright. And this chart looks at how copyright has now been extended so the duration can exceed 100 years for copyrighted material. The original intention of copyright in the Constitution was around authors who would have the right to their works for a period of time so that they could recover money, they could sell those works, but that at a certain point, what they were doing belonged to everyone, just like the work of classics belonged to everyone. We've now taken a view, particularly if it's owned by commercial interests, that those copyrights need to be extended perpetually, because that's part of the economic engine of a particular enterprise. So there are societal dialogues that need to take place with regard to the protection of intellectual property and the work in the public domain. An unintended consequence of the Sonny Bono Act was that there are thousands and thousands of films that are literally film on celluloid done in the 30s and 40s that were then covered by this act that cannot be used in the public domain. And so because people that would use them in mashups or other kinds of things can't figure out who the real owners are anymore. And so all of those resources, there are about 400,000, will literally turn to dust before their copyrights would expire. And what we're seeing now is this notion of intellectual property on steroids in a way that raises some very significant ethical issues, as this next clip shows.
The Jacobi RD case was one of the great judicial moments in world history, and the public was totally unaware it was actually happening as the process was being engaged. General Electric and Professor Jacobi RD went to the patent office with a little microbe that eats up oil spills. They said they had modified this microbe in the laboratory and therefore it was an invention. The patent office, the US government, took a look at this, quote, invention, and they said, no way. The patent statutes don't cover living things. This is not an invention. Turn down. Then General Electric and Dr. Jacobi RD appealed to the US Customs Court of Appeal. And to everyone's surprise, by a 3-2 decision, they overrode the patent office. And they said, this microbe looks more like a detergent or a reagent than a horse or a honeybee. I laughed because they didn't understand basic biology. It looked like a chemical to them. Had it had an antenna or eyes or wings or legs, it would never have crossed their table and been patented. Then the patent office appealed. And what the public should realize now is the patent office was very clear that you can't patent life. My organization provided the main amicus curiae brief. If you allow the patent on this microbe, we argued, it means that without any congressional guidance or public discussion, corporations will own the blueprints of life. When they made the decision, we lost by 5-4, and Chief Justice Warren Burger said, sure, some of these are big issues, but we think this is a small decision. 7 years later, the US Patent Office issued a one-sentence decree. You can patent anything in the world that's alive, except a full-birth human being.
The Supreme Court of the United States ruled today that living organisms produced in the laboratory may be patented. This decision to extend patent
the U.S. Supreme Court had to decide was whether one man or one company should be able to control new forms of life.
We allow any company or college to exclusively own a species. What does that say about our reverence for life?
Researchers at Harvard manipulated the genes of mice, making their offspring more susceptible to cancer. They patented the Harvard mouse in the U.S., Europe, and Japan, then tried to do the
legal
same
battle
here.
that finally came to an end today. The Supreme Court of Canada ruled the genetically engineered mouse can't be patented.
Canadians don't think that life forms are inventions of industry like light bulbs and wood chips.
Scientists and drug companies search the planet for genes. Companies scouring the planet looking for valuable DNA. Genes they can patent and sell.
It feels a lot like the Wild West. We've got bandits going around the world collecting wherever they can, sometimes under false pretenses.
Because it's being so isolated, Newfoundland has a unique gene pool, and there's been so much interest from gene prospectors.
My genetic blueprint really has been taken away from me.
Instead of being the impartial pursuit of the truth, has become the pursuit of profit.
We've all been hearing about the announcement that we have mapped the human genome, but what the public doesn't know is now there's a great race by genomic companies and biotech companies and life science companies to find the treasure in the map. The treasure are the individual genes that make up the blueprint of the human race. Every time they capture a gene and isolate it, these biotech companies claim it as intellectual property. The breast cancer gene, the cystic fibrosis gene, it goes on and on and on. If this goes unchallenged in the world community, within less than 10 years, a handful of global companies will own directly or through license the actual genes that make up the evolution of our species, and they're now beginning to patent the genomes of every other creature on this planet. In the age of biology, the politics is going to sort out between those who believe life first has intrinsic value, and therefore we should choose technologies and commercial venues that honor the intrinsic value, and then we're going to have people who believe, look, life is simply utility. It's commercial fare, and they will line up with the idea to let the marketplace be the ultimate arbiter of all of the age of biology.
So one of the questions that we in a business school have, in a university have, and as citizens have, is what kind of world do we want to unfold altogether? Do we want a world that works for everyone? Do we want a world that is contracted and restricted? And it's interesting because at a place like Notre Dame, we can draw on sources of wisdom that perhaps we couldn't talk about at other universities. So, but before talking about that, I just want to raise one other point, and it's around the Great Lakes. We recently did a conference here in September about looking at the Great Lakes as a commons. The Great Lakes are in trouble as bodies of water. All kinds of environmental issues, evaporation issues, invasive species issues, too much withdrawal of water from the lakes. And so citizens and Native American tribes in both Canada and the United States have come together to say, maybe if the lakes were treated as a commons, we would be better off. And so that initiative has been launched. And so that thrust is going on. At the same time that thrust is going on, there's a whole nother idea that water, which was originally res communes with Emperor Justinian, you might remember, is seen as a great investment opportunity. There is, I'll just read you a quote from the chief economist at Citibank, Wilhelm Boutier, recently said, I expect to see in the near future a massive expansion of investment in the water sector, including the production of fresh, clean water from other sources, such as desalination, storage, shipping, transportation of water. I expect to see water pipelines that will exceed the capacity of those for oil and gas today. I see fleets of water tankers and storage facilities that will dwarf those we currently use for oil and natural gas. I see new canal systems dug for water transportation, similar in ambition and scale to those currently in progress in China, linking the Yangtze River in the south to the Yellow River in the north. I expect to see a globally integrated market for fresh water within 25 to 30 years. Once the spot markets for water are integrated, futures markets and other derivative water-based financial instruments, puts, calls, swaps, both exchange-traded and OTC will follow. There'll be different grades and types of fresh water, just the way we have today, light sweet and heavy sour crude oil. Water as an asset class, in my view, will eventually become the single most important commodity-based asset class, dwarfing oil, copper, agricultural commodities, and precious metals. So, is this the world that you want to live in? There are today, you probably know, there are, think of this later today, the next drink of water, there are 1 billion people almost, 1 billion people that cannot get a drink of clean water today, don't have access to clean water. Will treating water as a commons, as we have historically done, or having ETFs for water, what will yield clean water for the world. Really doesn't take that much. UN says it would be $30 billion a year for clean water for everybody. And we spend $100 billion a year worldwide on bottled water. It wouldn't take that much. But it would take an intention to do that. So as we consider some of these issues, drawing from our own roots and asking some of these questions, we can go back to the church fathers, for instance. St. Ambrose, very interesting. For nature generously supplies everything for everyone in common. God ordained everything to be produced to provide food for everyone in common. His plan was that the earth should be, as it were, the natural possession of us all. Nature produced common rights. It is usurping greed that has established private rights. In an important encyclical, Pope John Paul II said, "The Church has always understood this right of private ownership within the broader context of the right common to all to use the good of the whole of creation. The right to private property is subordinated to the right to common use, to the fact that goods are meant for everyone." So if we want a world that works for everyone, how do we look at the systems and processes that will enable that? How do we honor the commons? And how do we enjoy our lives as commoners together? Thank you. So we could take a few questions if you have them. And if you don't, we'll sit silently.
Leo, what do you see as the first steps here? What's next? Beyond concern, what can be done?
Yes, well, I guess several things. One is in the area of public policy. How do we take into account the commons? Through Dean Wu's support, when Dean Wu was Dean Wu, we started a course in collaboration with the United Nations, an introductory course to the commons. It was offered last year. It's currently being offered again this year, right now. And last year we had 185 people from 70 countries taking this. Many were diplomats in the UN who wanted to learn more about the commons and how this framework could be potentially incorporated into policy considerations. There's a scholar in the Commons who's been working with several members of the G20 finance community to understand this notion of the commons more. We tend to operate with the notion of enclosure as a preferred way of life, and the extent to which we can educate people that there are more options would be certainly something that's preferable. And this May, there's an important conference in Berlin on the economics of the commons, and at that conference we hope to launch a global educational consortium for commons education that Notre Dame will be a founding member of. So education's important, policy shifts are important. I was giving a talk on the commons at Dow Chemical to several senior executives there. And one of them said, you know, maybe we should make the essence of this particular fertilizer a commons, so it would be available worldwide. And then we could make money with special applications of this fertilizer. That kind of thinking would change a lot, change things a lot.
Leo, I'd like to ask a question, and that is, can private property rights, the notion of private property and the notion of the commons coexist? Is there a boundary which is appropriate for each? Because this is a country and a capitalist system which rests on the notion of private property rights. So how do you see those two coexisting?
Yeah. Did you all hear the question? Can private property rights coexist with common property rights? Well, they absolutely must. And in many of the examples we showed earlier, they do. And so private property rights have unique dimensions to them, which include what's called alienation, meaning I can sell. I can alienate the land in my house, sell it to the next person. Common rights would be things that would be held, that would be stewarded in a trust intergenerationally, and so there could be resource, if the Great Lakes, for instance, were a commons, if that became accepted, those would be stewarded, there would be use rights and rentals paid for use of the lakes, for shipping lanes or whatever, to help clean them up. But it wouldn't impede private property rights of owners to actually use them. There'd have to be agreements. One of the most contentious areas right now is air. Who owns the atmosphere? Who would you say owns the atmosphere? It's a commons, right? Nobody owns it. And if it's a commons, then how would we best protect it? Is it with cap and trade, or is it more with something cap and rent? If you assign polluters permits, then they're effectively getting to use that as an externality from the beginning. If they have to pay a fee for that, or a rental agreement, you could do something different. So absolutely, we have to be able to have common structures that exist and coexist with private property, to be sure. How about one question from the audience? Yes?
What are some principles of stewardship that would apply beyond those natural resources types of settings? I'm thinking, for instance, of antibiotic stewardship, where we all hold in common the need for antibiotics to work if we're going to be able to be made well. However, there's often, on the individual level, a desire to get antibiotics even when they may not be appropriate, when they might not work and help you, and to use them in a way that is bad for the common good.
Yeah, well, that's a question that raises, there are two parts to your question, really. One is around the use of antibiotics, which is what's the responsible use of that as a resource. The second is, which I think might be really helpful, and more to the point, is should pharmaceutical companies have a right to claim intellectual property for something they develop? As societies globally, we have said yes to that. You should be able to charge. But should it be reasonable if it's in a developing nation and it's an AIDS vaccine, as an example? And so those things need to be navigated and worked out. The use question is really one of responsible practice in terms of healthcare practice altogether. When Jonas Salk developed the polio vaccine, he didn't put a patent on it. Somebody said, well, who owns this? And he was interviewed and said, what do you mean, who owns it? It's for humanity. So there are different views in terms of how this needs to proceed and how we need to recover things. And one of the challenges we have, and it relates to Carolyn's question on private property, is right now we have a system of accounting that says, if something's not on a balance sheet, it doesn't have value. In other words, if you can't put a price around it, it doesn't have value. And that's one of the arguments around water right now. But we know there's intrinsic value. We know there are gift economies that don't rely on the pricing model of the market. And so we need other accounting structures that take that into account. Yes?
Along the lines of patent companies patenting And just looking at that situation is kind of a bit of a prisoner's dilemma. I mean, if one company says we're not going to patent something that we discover in a laboratory, and they run the risk of that knowledge being out there and another company doing it. So how do you go about really kind of cutting across that and attacking that situation?
Yeah. So you can't have one actor make a unilateral decision because they would end up being disadvantaged if it's not agreed upon by everybody. And so in that kind of case, we need a societal dialogue to say what we think is the right approach or not. I mean, do you agree that all genes should be patented, for example? I had a student, an EMBA student. He was 55 years old. He was a dentist getting his MBA, and told a story about he had a friend who had a very rare form of breast cancer. She was really worried. Went in to see what kind of treatment she could get, was told there was a special experimental treatment that she could get that could really help her. She decided to get that, and she had to sign a lot of forms and papers. Unbeknownst to her, in signing those forms and papers, she was assigning her breast cancer gene to a biotech company. So she got the treatment. The company then claimed ownership of her genes and actually prevented university researchers at a university who were working on that same breast cancer as violating their intellectual property rights. So clearly that doesn't make sense. So how do we have a dialogue with our elected officials of what we really want as a society? These are complex, and so we need to be able to have the argument simplified so more of us can participate.
So as we use resources faster than they recuperate, how do you see this playing out? Will the nations get along and come up with a solution, or is it going to be the strongest wins? Or
yeah, how does this play out in terms of our global footprint and where we're heading? Well, look, a lot of the ideas that we currently have in our collective operating system were developed at an earlier point in time when we were in a different situation. And we're at a point in history which is utterly unique today. This is the first time in human history where humankind is capable of seeing itself as a totality. And, you know, it's one thing to overuse resources when you only have 1 billion people on the planet, or 3 billion. When John Kennedy was inaugurated as president, most of you weren't here then, but some of you were, there were only 3 billion people. Today we've got 7, we're heading to 10. We're out of space. Everybody in China wants the kind of stuff that you have. It's not going to work. So if we can, we need to reframe what it constitutes to have a good life. We need to look at what some of the basics are and how those are done and supplied. And if we don't do that, there's going to be a lot of trouble. So one of the questions you have to ask is at least that I ask, is the system of governance that we have in the world up for the task? And the clear answer, in my view, is, are you kidding? Are you kidding? No way. If you look at these climate change conferences that are held every year by the UN, it's not that these guys don't get to a solution. They can't get to a solution. Structurally, they can't get to a solution. If each of you represented one of the nations in the world, and we're trying to figure out climate change, you're trying to solve that issue through the lens of limited self-interest of your nation state. What America's position is, what Egypt's position is, what Yemen's position is, what Vietnam's position is. We can't get there from here with that kind of orientation. So it's not that nation states are going to go away, but they'll, in the near term, but they'll be superseded by other kinds of more elastic structures, I think. And that will include things like commons. So the interesting thing about the Great Lakes Commons is it will span 2 different nation states, Canada and the US. That might take 10 years. Who knows? We'll see. So I think we need a new game. I think we need a new game. Yeah. Oh, there and then there.
My question is, how do we determine what can be a commons? Because I feel like you can argue that everything is a common, like land, air, food, agriculture, seeds. Like, how do you draw a line between what can really be a commons and what can't be a commons?
Yeah, what's the line between what's a commons and what's not a commons? Yes. Well, the things that we share together are commons. Things that there's historical law around things that can be owned. We know that through history, you can own your clothes. There's not an issue with that. You can own your car. You can't own the air that you're breathing. So part of it's a practical demarcation altogether. But then part of it becomes, how do we want to manage things? What are our societal decisions? So for instance, at universities today, there is enormous pressure financially on universities to license intellectual property. And but 50 years ago, that notion wasn't part of the formula. Are we better off doing that? Or are we better off contributing, looking at all the intellectual property that's created as part of a commons? I don't know what the answer to that is, but we need to have dialogues around that. Do you still have a question? And then we're going to wrap up soon. Jim, you call it when it's time.
So I guess my question surrounds, maybe some potential. Do you see any potential risks as far as having greater significance for the commons? Because, I mean, earlier in your speech you mentioned how the West has a really great emphasis on privatization and kind of having your own as opposed to being part of the commons. But at the same time, America was, from my understanding at least, was founded greatly on people coming over here and kind of increasing their freedom and going their own way to kind of achieve what they wanted to in life. So could you see a potential conflict with that, and are there any risks that you're aware of?
Sure. Well, there are always risks where there's a lack of wisdom in any structure. So whatever we're doing, whether it's with the commons or anything else, we need to kind of really feel into it deeply. One of the philosophical propositions that people migrated, that European settlers migrated here to America, was with the notion that really springs from John Locke's theory of value, that takes a look about property and private property. And Locke had some good intentions, because he was saying if people can own stuff, then the king doesn't own everything. And then there's a certain kind of freedom that accords with that. That got translated, particularly in the domain of land, where if there isn't a deed on the property, then it's not owned. And so I can stake a claim for it. But as we saw with the Kenyan lawyer, hey, if you go in that direction, a lot of people that are used to what's called customary use or customary law are going to get short shrift. So it's really important to take into account everybody's rights, even if they don't have the same, you might say, operating system that you do. So Native Americans say, hey, look, you're asking me, can you use my land? Well, sure, I don't know what use means altogether, but come and enjoy it like we do and my family and that kind of stuff, and we build a fence around it. So there's got to be a way that we can come up with, you might say, a new operating system that transcends, moves beyond where we've been, that takes into account the obvious facts that some stuff we need to own. We need to own it because it's part of our responsibility for having a productive, useful life. Some stuff we can't own. That ownership is the wrong question. Do you own love? Doesn't make any sense. And some stuff we need to talk about.
Do you see a dynamic going forward between Pigovian taxes and the commons, and do you think that's a viable solution in the short run or long run as a way to manage our natural resources and decrease pollution and things like that going
I'm sorry,
forward?
between what?
Pigovian taxes, eco-taxes,
Eco-taxes.
and the commons?
Yeah, I think there's a whole debate going around that on how taxes could be levied in ways that incent certain kinds of behavior that reduce use or waste of resources. So definitely, I think that's in the mix.
Okay, one more, if there is one. Yeah?
What?
Burke, thank you very kindly for your time and your energy. We deeply appreciate that.
Hey, man, great to see you, Jim.